All right, get ready to dive into some deep waters today. We're tackling a comparison you might not expect.
Yeah.
African slavery and the Dalit discrimination
Yeah.
in India's caste system. You sent us this editorial, and wow, the parallels it points out they're unexpected and pretty disturbing, honestly.
Yeah. Not exactly late conversation, but,
Mm.
sometimes those tough topics lead to the biggest aha moments.
For sure. So geographically, historically, we're talking about systems miles apart, right? But this editorial really digs into how they operate, the mechanics of oppression. They actually share some really striking similarities. And look, we're not here to play which is worse. That's pointless game.
Right.
But we are going to get into the how, like how these systems work, so you can start to spot these patterns of injustice anywhere.
Yeah, it's about understanding the underlying principles, those levers of control that keep these systems going, no matter the context.
Okay, so the editorial starts by looking at the basis of discrimination in each system.
Hmm.
On the surface, they seem like totally different.
You think so? I mean, African slavery was built on this horrific idea that Africans were inferior, less than human, basically. And that was used to justify their enslavement.
And in India, you have this ancient caste system with Dalits, who were once called untouchables, pushed to the very bottom of this rigid social hierarchy.
Right, and that whole hierarchy, it hinges on these ideas of purity and pollution, deeply rooted in religious and social beliefs that dictate who you can even interact with, marry, even where you can live. It's really rigid.
But here's where the editorial gets like mind-blowing. It says, both systems managed to turn birth certificates into worth certificates, deciding a person's value before they even took their first step.
Whoa.
Whoa is right.
Yeah, that line really struck me too. It's about taking away individual agency, Like regardless of your talents, your potential, your character, your worth is predetermined based on nothing but the circumstances of your birth. Imagine carrying that weight from day one. Have you ever caught yourself thinking like that, even subtly?
You know, it's funny you say that because, yeah, I've caught myself making assumptions about people based on their background,
Yeah.
without even realizing it. It's kind of scary how ingrained those biases can be.
Oh, it is. And that's part of what makes these systems so insidious. They become so normal, we often don't even question them. But back to the parallels. Once worth is kind of established, both systems move to deny basic human rights systematically.
The list it's heartbreaking. For slaves, we're talking denial of freedom, education, property ownership, even the right to keep their families together. And to enforce all this, violence it was a constant threat.
And for Dalits, historically it's being barred from temples, water sources, education. Even today, you see social ostracism, violence, despite the fact that untouchability is outlawed. The editorial mentions Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, a brilliant Dalit scholar, faced incredible obstacles just to get an education. Makes you wonder, how many brilliant minds were just crushed by these systems?
It's infuriating. The editorial points out that denying education, that's a key tactic of control. But why? Why is knowledge so powerful in these situations specifically?
Well, think about it. For slaves, literacy was a direct threat to the power structure. A slave who could read, they could read abolitionist writings, forge passes, even organize rebellions.
Ah, I see.
That's why it was outlawed in many places.
And for Dalits, education offered a path to challenge the caste system. It meant understanding their rights, having access to better opportunities, and ultimately breaking free.
Exactly. Knowledge empowers critical thinking, self-determination, both of which undermine systems built on control and keeping people down.
Okay, so we have this predetermined worth and the denial of basic rights. What's next? Chilling parallel.
Both systems were, fundamentally, about economic exploitation. They relied on the forced labor of the oppressed group to generate wealth.
So for slavery, that meant unpaid labor, building this whole plantation economy on the backs of enslaved Africans, all the profits going right to the slave owners.
And for Dalits, it often means being relegated to these menial and dangerous jobs that nobody else wants, like manual scavenging. It's officially banned, but the lack of opportunity and the stigma keep many Dalits trapped in this cycle.
It's like that line from the editorial. When your job description is, do the work no one else will touch, it's clear the system stinks in more ways than one.
It's not just about the work itself, it's the disgust attached to it. It makes the individual feel inherently less worthy.
Exactly. It dehumanizes and it reinforces that power imbalance that we keep coming back to. But it's not just about economic control. It's about keeping these groups separate, isolated, and ultimately easier to exploit.
Which leads us to the next parallel. Social segregation. How did these systems physically keep people apart? Well, with slavery, think about the Jim Crow laws in the U.S.,
Right.
which, legally enforce racial segregation. But even before those laws, there were powerful social norms that dictated where Black people could live, could eat, could even sit on a bus. It was all about maintaining this hierarchy where one group had absolute power over the other.
And in a caste system, you have restrictions on social interaction, intercaste marriage is taboo, and there's often residential segregation, with Dalit villages literally separated from.
Right.
Upper caste communities, it's giving me whites-only vibes.
Yeah.
Like during U.S. segregation.
It is. It's a disturbing echo, isn't it? Both systems using physical separation to control access to resources and opportunities, ensuring that the oppressed group remains disadvantaged. Does this remind you of any forms of segregation, even subtle ones, maybe in housing patterns, school districts, even social circles?
That's a tough question. I'm going to be reflecting on that for sure. But for now, let's move on to the next chilling parallel: violence and intimidation.
Sadly, this is a common thread, throughout history. Both systems used violence to maintain control and instill fear. For slaves, it was the constant threat of whippings, lynchings, other horrific punishments, all designed to break their spirits, make them compliant.
And for Dalits, violence persists today in the form of assaults, rapes, murders. It's horrifying that even in the 21st century, the National Crime Records Bureau in India reports thousands of crimes against Dalits every year. The editorial gets kind of dark here. It says, oppression often comes with a manual. How to Keep People Down 101. Sadly, it's a bestseller across different societies.
It is a tragically funny observation, isn't it? It really highlights how these tactics are not unique to any one time or place. They get repeated, adapted, across cultures, and throughout history. But what's truly disturbing is the impact this violence has on the human psyche, both for the individual and across generations. Yeah, it's a chilling thought that those tactics keep popping up, but you're right, we can't just ignore the damage that violence does to individuals and to whole communities.
Because trauma like that, it doesn't just go away, it leaves a mark.
Right, and one of the most damaging things is the loss of identity.
In slavery, we know that people were systematically stripped of their names, their languages, their cultures. It was like a deliberate attempt to erase their history, their sense of self.
And for Dalits, it's that constant message of being inferior, unworthy, untouchable. Imagine hearing that day in and day out, not just from individuals, but from the entire structure of society. How could you not internalize that?
It's like constantly having your humanity denied over and over again.
Exactly. And that trauma doesn't just impact the individual. It echoes through families, through communities.
The editorial talks about the concept of post-traumatic slave syndrome, which I'll admit I'm not that familiar with. Is there a similar thing for Dalit communities?
There isn't one specific term. But researchers have documented the lasting effects, the psychological effects of caste-based oppression. I mean, think about it. Centuries of systematic discrimination, social exclusion, and violence that creates a pervasive sense of fear, hopelessness, limited expectations. Impacts mental health, self-esteem, aspirations. It creates this cycle of disadvantage that can be incredibly hard to break.
That's heartbreaking. But amidst all this darkness, the editorial highlights the parallel journeys towards equality in both situations.
Absolutely. Both the abolitionist movement and the struggle for Dalit rights have been marked by incredible courage, resilience, and a refusal to just accept things the way they are.
Think about figures like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, risking their lives to fight for freedom. Their bravery is just awe-inspiring.
And in India, you have Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who we talked about earlier. He led the movement for Dalit rights and played a crucial role in drafting India's constitution, which, explicitly outlaws caste discrimination.
The editorial makes this great point, I'm quoting here. Changing the world often starts with someone refusing to accept that that's just the way it is. Thank goodness for the rebels with a cause. It's a good reminder that individuals, they really can spark massive change, even against what seem like impossible odds.
It's inspiring, right? And both movements led to sadly, no. The legacy of slavery and the caste system, it it continues to cast a shadow, even today.
The editorial mentions this, the persistence of systemic inequality.
Yeah. In the U.S., we see it in, the disproportionate incarceration rates for African Americans, the persistent income gap, the ongoing struggle for equal educational opportunity.
And in India, Dalits are still underrepresented in higher education and formal employment. They face huge income disparities and are often trapped in cycles of poverty, even though officially untouchability is outlawed. It's a reminder that progress can be really slow and that the fight for equality is far from over. And the editorial makes this really powerful connection between the Black Lives Matter movement in the U.S. and the protests against Dalit atrocities in India. It's not just a historical comparison. It's about recognizing the ongoing reality of discrimination in both contexts.
Exactly. Both movements highlight that these issues are not relics of the past. They're very much alive in the present, and they require our attention and our action.
Like the 2016 Una flogging incident in India, where Dalit men were brutally attacked for skinning a dead cow. It sparked protests across the country. It shows how raw these wounds still are.
It's a tragic illustration of how deeply ingrained these prejudices are and how easily they erupt into violence, even in modern India. And it's not just about these overt acts of violence. The editorial talks about how prejudice, it persists in more subtle ways.
It's those hidden biases, the unconscious assumptions that we all carry, even if we don't realize it.
Think about it. A casual comment. A seemingly harmless joke. A stereotype that just gets repeated without a second thought. These things, they may seem small, but they reinforce those harmful narratives and they perpetuate discrimination.
The editorial puts it this way. Prejudice is like a stubborn stain. You can cover it up, but it takes real effort to get it out completely. Ugh, it's so true. It's that hidden bias that we all have to be vigilant against.
Absolutely. And it's not just about being nice or avoiding offense. It's about actively challenging those biases within ourselves and in the systems that we're a part of. But I think there's a bigger question here. Why do these systems persist? What's the danger of holding on to these caste practices, even in these subtle ways?
That's a great question. Why are these systems so hard to shake? What's the cost of not addressing them head on?
That's the core of it, right? The editorial argues that clinging to these systems, even in those subtle ways, it actually hinders social harmony and economic development. It's not just a moral issue. It's a practical one with real-world consequences.
So it's hurting everyone, not just the groups being oppressed.
Exactly. When you exclude a significant portion of society from opportunity, you're basically wasting human potential. Think about all the talent, all the innovation that's lost when people are held back solely because of, their caste or the color of their skin.
It's like we're shooting ourselves in the foot collectively.
Right. And that kind of persistent injustice, it breeds resentment, division, and ultimately social unrest. It destabilizes whole society.
The editorial brings up the 2020 Hathras case in India, where a Dalit woman was brutally assaulted and later died. It sparked outrage, protests across the country.
Yeah.
It shows how these issues are still so alive.
Yeah.
And how deeply they impact people's lives.
Yeah, the Hathras case is a tragic example. That the fight for equality, it's far from over, both in India and globally. We all have a role to play in dismantling these systems. And it starts with understanding how they operate, even in their more subtle forms.
Okay, so we need to understand how these systems work, even the hidden stuff. But where do we even begin?
It starts with education. Reading books, watching documentaries, listening to podcasts like this one, seeking out diverse perspectives, especially from those who have experienced oppression firsthand. Their stories are so valuable in helping us understand the human cost of these systems.
Right, so educating ourselves is key. But what about action? Like, what can we actually do in our daily lives to challenge injustice?
Well, one of the most powerful things you can do is speak up. When you see or hear something that's wrong, you don't need a megaphone, you don't need a platform. Even small acts of resistance can create a ripple effect.
So like calling out that off-color joke at a party.
Yeah.
Or questioning a stereotype when you hear it, even if it feels awkward.
Exactly. Silence often implies agreement. So speaking up, even in small ways, it signals that those attitudes are not okay.
It's also about looking inward. Right, examining our own behaviors and asking ourselves, am I contributing to this problem, even unintentionally?
That kind of self-reflection is crucial. We all have blind spots, so it's important to stay open to feedback, be willing to learn, and actively work to unlearn those harmful biases.
Okay, so education, self-reflection, speaking up. What else can we do to really dismantle these systems?
Supporting organizations that are fighting for social justice, that's key. Whether it's, racial justice, gender equality, LGBTQ plus rights, Dalit empowerment. There are countless groups out there doing incredible work. Donate your time, your money, your skills. Every little bit helps.
And don't forget the power of voting. Electing officials who are committed to justice and who will advocate for policies that promote equality. That's crucial for creating lasting change. So we've got a lot on our plate. Educating ourselves, speaking out, challenging our own biases, supporting organizations, voting for change. It feels kind of overwhelming. Where do we even start?
Start small. Pick one thing that resonates with you and focus on that. Maybe it's volunteering at a local organization or having those tough conversations with family and friends. Remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about showing up and doing what you can, even when it's uncomfortable.
Right. Baby steps, but consistent action. This conversation has been eye-opening, to say the least. I have a new understanding of how insidious oppression can be and how it can manifest in so many ways. And I feel a real responsibility to challenge injustice
Yeah.
wherever I see it.
That's the spirit. And remember, the fight for equality, it's a collective one. It requires all of us to be engaged, to be active participants.
It can feel like an uphill battle sometimes.
Yeah.
But as we've learned today, progress is possible. Every act of resistance, every voice raised against injustice, it brings us closer to a world where everyone's worth
Hmm.
is recognized, regardless of their background or circumstances.
Well said. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about and hopefully a lot to act on. So to our listeners out there, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a world where everyone has a chance to reach their full potential. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.